Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to share some work with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Um, I will just say it's so great to see some folks from Florida on the call. That's my home state, so my heart is always with my home state of Florida, and I'm so glad that you guys are safe and are joining us here today. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, so yeah, I'm from Florida, but I did my undergraduate here in California at Pepperdine University, and then I did my PhD at the University of Utah where I started some of this work with my colleagues listed here on my slide deck. And now I'm so excited to be at Berkeley Haas as a racial equity postdoctoral scholar. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work as a management scholar, the things I think about. Really, I try to make them applicable to today's business leaders. What are we actually recommending for building psychological safety in the workplace? And I love the way that Marco opened this up to think about all these different pieces of the puzzle, right? Like we all have a place to play in this solution. So I'm going to be talking about organization level initiatives today and how they differentially affect different types of employees through the lens of psychological safety. Um, if you have thought about psychological safety before, you may have heard of this construct in your workplace, but I'll just give you a brief overview of how we think about it theoretically when we research psychological safety, what that actually means. I'm then going to talk about who feels safe. So psychological safety may not apply to everyone equally. Then I'm going to talk about the effect of organization level inclusion signals on psychological safety and how that can impact psychological safety for a broad range of employees. And finally, I'm hoping to leave you with some actionable insights on how you can increase psychological safety and make your places more equitable for lots of different types of people. So hopefully I can leave you with some actionable insights that you can start working on today. I'll also be taking questions on the research and more generally, if you have them in the Q&A box. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and get right into it. So what is psychological safety? Psychological safety is about interpersonal risk. It is the idea that it's okay to express yourself in the workplace, express your concerns, express criticisms. It's the idea that you can speak up, that you have voice in the workplace, or that you can admit when you're wrong. I'm sure that you can think of this feeling if you have it in your workplace or not. And really what I'm talking about is this idea of interpersonal risk taking. Is it okay for me to take risks with my colleagues in this workplace? And psychological safety is really important for a number of organizational outcomes. Specifically, it helps people speak up. It gives voice to those who need it. It helps when employees need to learn or adapt to change. In today's modern world, in today's modern work industry, you have to be able to learn new things, learn new skills rapidly, and adapt to changing environments. It also helps foster creativity when people feel like they can freely speak up and it's okay to be wrong. You get more ideas, you get a broader range of diverse opinions, which is one of the more important aspects of psychological safety, is that it encourages employees to voice across differences. So as we continue to diversify organizations across a number of characteristics, both visible and non-visible, you'll probably have people with different perspectives. And it's really important to get those people to speak up in these environments. So you can imagine that psychological safety is a really key variable for understanding how employees work together in groups and teams in organizations. But of course, there are organizational characteristics that can negatively impact psychological safety. I'm going to talk about this through the lens of social norms. So like what's normal behavior in your organization, because that can affect psychological safety very broadly. So things that are kind of broadly known to negatively affect psychological safety in the organization are things like lack of candor, when people aren't honest when they need to be. That can make things feel less safe. It can make it feel like you can't be honest when you need to be. Unclear expectations have also been shown to really negatively affect psychological safety in the workplace. And even things like incivility, which are unfortunate, but still common in the workplace. When workplaces allow incivility to occur, these are all things that send signals about the psychological environment in which we're working. It might cause somebody to ask, is this a safe place? Is this a safe place to speak up, to take interpersonal risks when I see these types of things happening in the organization in which I work? But there are other types of signals that might not broadly affect everyone the same way. These are things like microaggressions or lack of diversity in leadership, unequal treatment or disparities, or mega threats, which are things that actually happen outside of the organization in the broader social and political context. And these are all things that I'm arguing are disproportionately going to affect the psychological safety of those with marginalized identities, those who are targeted by these negative signals. And that changes the question from, is this a safe place, to, is this a safe place for people like me? And so what this creates is an unfortunate psychological safety deficit, which is one of the broad topics of my research. I think about the way that while even organizations that have generally pro-social environments that may seem relatively healthy, if you don't take care of these pre-existing deficits, even though psychological safety might rise and fall, you'll still see this deficit between those with marginalized identities and those with majority group identities in their psychological experiences of the workplace. So even while things may appear on the surface to be healthy, you may not be seeing an underlying psychological safety deficit that exists. And this is problematic because I know through some of my research that disparities in psychological safety can lead to even more negative effects. And one way is that you lose the benefits of diverse teams when not everyone feels like they can speak up. You can imagine that we really want, if we have diversity in our groups and teams, it would be a problem if certain groups of people felt like they couldn't voice their thoughts and opinions. You really lose the benefit of having a diverse team when that's the case. And some employees may feel pressure to hide parts of themselves or code switch if they feel like that particular identity might be a risky one to share. I'll pause for a moment and just ask, do we have any questions about the broad concept of psychological safety in the workplace? Okay. So at this point,
Well, I guess,
go ahead.
hi, Alex, Dr. Figueroa. I saw the slide with the two, looks like box whisker charts or bar charts. And I was curious what those two different, um, like, is that before an intervention and after an intervention? And kind of like, what does that actually mean in terms of like how an organization, um, like how an organization like responds to DEI interventions or programs. Like what does it mean? It seems like those were a before and after type of measure, and I couldn't tell like what that meant. And I don't know if that's too specific or I'm sorry if that's not the appropriate spot to ask this question.
No, that's a great question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify, because I can see how that would be a little bit confusing. And I'm sorry, I couldn't quite see who was speaking, so I'm not sure what your name is, but I hope that we can connect also at the social tonight. So what I'm talking about here is the idea that I think when organizations think about psychological safety, we think about broad measures of creating healthy environments, things that apply to, everybody. We want to make sure that generally we have like a pro-social organization that people feel like they're comfortable speaking up. But what I'm arguing in this work is that while that might raise psychological safety, so this is not part of the research yet. This is kind of just a visual aid to help with understanding what I'm talking about. So like if you can imagine these bars on the left, they might be like a generally good, healthy pro-social environment. And the bars on the right might be a less healthy organization. But even in organizations that would be considered healthy and pro-social without intentional targeting to rectify this deficit, you do see increases in psychological safety, but the deficit still exists. And that's the problem that I think that we have in organizations when we don't really take action to heal that psychological deficit. And so the work that I'm going to present next is my attempt at thinking about how organizations can use targeted DEI signals to rectify this deficit. So I will come back. You'll see a lot more of these box plots that look, or these bar charts that look very similar to this, that I'm hoping you'll be able to recollect this topic that I'm talking about now when I get to the data. But I wanted to quickly tell you the context in which I'm studying this, because this last element here, that when you have these psychological safety deficits, those who are at a psychological deficit may feel like they need to hide parts of themselves. And that's a particular identity group that I wanted to focus on this research, because identity concealment can cause extreme psychological strain. And so in this research, I'm really looking at those who have concealable stigmatized identities. Specifically in this project, I'm looking at sexual and gender minorities, or if you, the LGBTQIA community. Because these identities are not always readily visible, and it takes a lot of work to conceal them. And I'm talking about active concealment, not privacy concerns, but feeling like you can't be your whole self in the workplace. Um, and I think that sometimes organized prioritize visible aspects of diversity because it's easier to see. It's understandable why that would be the case, but they may not see existing psychological safety deficits from those when identities are less visible. And so this is a really important research context for me for studying this type of deficit. And finally, since we're talking about social norms, I think that we can leverage things happening at the organization level to influence social norms and psychological safety at the individual level. So this is the broad context in which I'm studying this, but that led me to think about what inclusion signals might look like at the organization level. And when I talk about inclusion signals, I'm talking about an organizational approach or belief or stance that inclusion and its management is important. So these are any signals that affirm the experiences or promote the inclusion of disadvantaged populations. And I know that sounds very broad, but really the parameters of what I'm talking about are things that are targeted, so we know who they're aimed at, and they're specific, so we know exactly what the organization is trying to do. As a couple examples, things like organizational allyship statements, employee resource groups, intentional DEI initiatives that are, publicly discussed, and even things more concrete like equality in the benefits and healthcare that people in your organization get. These are all examples of things that happen at the organization level that signal something about the norms of the environment in which we work. I think another great example is what we're doing today, this Berkeley Haas Diversity Symposium. This signals something about what Berkeley Haas values, right? We care about diversity as a community, and it's specific and it's targeted in nature, right? We're very clear on, and I love that Marco opened this with such a clear definition of DEIB and such a clear discussion of what Berkeley Haas is trying to do. It communicates, again, something about the psychological safety norms of this environment. And the issue that I think arises is that not everybody feels this way. So I'm going to tell you a little story from my alma mater where I just finished my PhD, the University of Utah. This is the Block U. It's in kind of the center of campus, and it's known for being a place where students can express themselves. It changes in color kind of depending on the season. And during Pride Month, traditionally, the Block U is always wrapped in Pride colors, just to signal that the campus is kind of celebrating all together. Many of you, I saw people from all over the country, and so many of you may be familiar with some of the legislative action that's been occurring in states like Utah. And this is one example of just a state legislator who proposed a bill to effectively stop any targeted race and gender efforts, and basically remove any language that even references the words diversity, equity, and inclusion from public institutions in Utah, including universities. And so what this bill that unfortunately eventually passed did was really argue that diversity efforts, these targeted and specific inclusion efforts, they actually foster discrimination, that they might psychologically harm those who are not targeted by this effort, by this signal. And so this is unfortunate because, now that this bill has passed, they've effectively closed the DEI offices in the state at the university, and really taken away any sort of targeted inclusion efforts that focus on gender equality or racial inequality. Really anything targeted and specific is now not permitted at the university. And so it really struck me that this topic that we're talking about, and even Marco brought it up, that perhaps these targeted efforts could harm those who are not targeted by them, right? The majority group, or even those who are just not specific to the community that we're discussing at the moment, that they could be psychologically harmed in these environments by such inclusion efforts. And so that's where this particular paper is going. So I'm curious, like, do these institutional level signals affect employees from both groups? Because you could imagine a scenario in which these inclusion signals, we're starting at the psychological safety deficit, in which these inclusion signals don't rectify the deficit, but they reverse it. I think that's what this state legislator would argue, that when we have targeted inclusion signals, it actually decreases the psychological safety of majority group members. Even if it is increasing the psychological safety of others, then it wouldn't be, then maybe it would be overall net harmful. But what I think is actually more likely, based on what we know about psychological climates and organizations and the origins of psychological safety, is that I think that psychological safety for those who lack it can actually, when we repair that, make the environment more positive for everybody. So these targeted signals, if I'm correct in my theorizing, they rectify the deficit, but they should also be kind of generally positive signals for everybody else as well about the environment and the broad prioritization of inclusion and fairness, right? Those are kind of the signals that we're sending when we do this targeted inclusion. And so these are my official research questions with this project. First, do organization level inclusion signals make a positive difference in psychological safety for both those who are targeted and those who are not targeted? And do organization level inclusion signals positively influence the way that we engage in this risky but positive, constructive workplace behavior as a consequence? Before I get into the data portion of my talk, are there any questions at this point?
And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, folks.
And this is only specific to LGBTQ plus like populations and queer folks within,
there.
like, so is this measured based off of
Is this measured based off of, sorry, there's a little bit of, are you asking about the way that I measure the identity group? Like how I verify?
Sorry, yeah, so read the question on inclusion signals, and it's specific to LGBTQ plus individuals. And I'm curious to know if this is on queer, so I'm sorry, let me kind of clarify. So my name is Ozo, and I'm also like queer identifying, and I saw that in the question, and so I asked because like, is this about like folks who choose, like, what level of disclosure is this measuring?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was kind of.
Don't apologize. I think I understand what you're saying, and this is a really important question to ask. So I'll clarify just right now. I have another slide that also I'll touch on this, but just off the bat, I think this is an important thing to clarify. So this community, the two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, asexual plus community is, as you can tell, as I just go through that acronym, a very diverse and broad community. It encompasses things like sexual orientation and gender identity, which are distinct concepts. And when we do research on a community that is this diverse and this broad, it's important to be clear about the boundaries of the data that I collect and the generalizability of these findings to such a broad community. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because when we do research on this type of community, it may not be generalizable across a full spectrum of identities. So in the data that I have that I'm working with, and this is why I use the abbreviated acronym in some places, I'm specifically collecting data from those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and or transgender. And I compare them to people who identify as cisgender and heterosexual. That is not always the case in this type of research, but I did want to clarify the boundaries of the data, excuse me, that I have available. And so I can say that this is the case for the people that I studied, but it may not be generalizable to other gender identities or sexual orientation that I did not study. I will also say, I'm sorry, there was another question about the question about concealment. And so when I think about concealment or disclosure in the context of this research, there's one aspect of it that is like privacy concerns, right? Like you may not want to share details about your personal life in your workplace. But the thing that we're considering when we think about identity disclosure or concealment is the psychological work that it takes to hide parts of yourself that you wish that you didn't have to hide. And when you think about the way that those who are not part of this community, those who are cisgender and heterosexual, engage in their workplace, they often don't have to think twice before talking about what they did this weekend. If I said, I went to the park with my husband, I don't have to think about how that might be perceived. Or if I have a picture of my family on my desk, that's not something that I have to think about being worried about who sees it. And so what we're working on is just trying to reduce the amount of identity concealment labor that has to happen in the workplace, because that is what has been shown to be so psychologically tolling. And we see that as separate from personal privacy preferences, right? Like what you decide that you do or do not want to share in the workplace, because we all have boundaries like that I think differ from person to person. So thank you so much for that question. I hope I answered it adequately, but if not, please leave me a comment in the chat and I'd be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A portion. Okay, so I am going to just really quickly run through my actual formal hypotheses. So if you are a data person, maybe this will be interesting to you. I'll talk about what I actually predicted. And so first, I'm predicting that broadly, I think organization level inclusion signals broadly benefit the psychological climate of any organization, and that this direct effect will be positive and significant. But if we remember that we're aiming at rectifying a pre-existing deficit, we should see that there is a moderation, or that this effect is conditional on the identity of the person that's reporting their psychological safety. So that the effect of organizational level inclusion signals should be larger for those who are targeted by it, because we're aimed at rectifying that deficit, right? And when we think about risky value aligned behaviors in this context, the things that are important to me, as I just mentioned, are identity sharing. So we want to see if identity sharing increases for those who have a stigmatized identity. And for those who are not LGBT, we ask them about their individual ally work. So how likely are they to, at the individual level, when they see something, to say something, right? To act as an ally for this community. And the reason we think that this is important is because we're really trying to measure organizational norms, right? Like what is considered to be positive, normal behavior in this particular organization based on the signals that they are sending. So broadly, we're expecting this kind of pattern, that these organization level inclusion signals will benefit the psychological safety climate of the organization and lead to positive, risky, value aligned behaviors that are just slightly different based on the identity group that you're particularly looking at. Okay, so this is where I just had a quick disclaimer, but I think I've covered this based on the question. And so you may just, as I'm going through the slides, you may see me use like an abbreviated acronym, and that's just to be very clear about the data that I have available. And so we can't always in science generalize, especially across such a diverse population. So what I'll claim in this particular paper applies to the communities that I'm studying, but I don't want to make too broad of claims given that we live in such a diverse intersectional world. Okay. So in this research, I employ 3 studies, and they're 3 different types of studies. So when we're doing research, it's important to understand like a couple things about the effects that we see. We want to know if it's causal, we want to know if it's isolated, and we want to know if it also just like applies to real world circumstances. And so those are the aims I have when I go into this research. And so the first study, I'm not manipulating anything, but I wanted to see if I could find this in employees' real experiences. So what I did is I just asked them to self-report. So what I did was I recruited participants who were working either full or part-time to tell me about their workplace experiences. I wanted to know how psychologically safe that they felt, how likely they were to engage in identity disclosure or concealment, how likely they were to engage in individual level ally work. And I wanted to know how well they thought their organization did at sending these organization level inclusion signals. And so to do that, I found a pre-existing measure of organization level inclusion signals that are common in organizations right now. And I got this from the Human Rights Campaign, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of work in this community, and one of their aims is to increase equality in the workplace. Part of how the Human Rights Campaign does this is by evaluating the Fortune 1000 company list on these 4 criteria, which are called the Corporate Quality Index criteria. This is publicly available. I encourage you to go look at this on the HRC website. I think it's a fantastic index that I use in a lot of my research. But really what this organization is doing is rating these each workplace on if they are protecting this community, if they have inclusive healthcare benefits, just general benefits, and if they're supporting an inclusive culture, and if they have corporate social responsibility. And this is like a very long index, so I'm not going to drag you through the whole thing, but I'll give you just a quick summary of what this looks like. So these are a couple of the questions that we asked our participants. Has your organization done these things? And then we did some simple math and just took the number of things that they said yes to over the number of things that they knew about. So sometimes you might not know if your organization is doing these things, but for us, it's important that they know. So we took the number of things that the organization is doing over the total number of things that they knew about to give a score. 0 signaling to 1, which would be they do all of the right things. And so what we found is that in low signaling environments, organizations that don't do very much signaling, psychological safety is still relatively high, right? Like psychological safety, at least for the folks that we talked to, was above average. I would say about average. But you can still see here that LGBT employees are existing at a psychological safety deficit, that there is a significant difference between the red dot and the gray dot, the red dot representing those who are not LGBT, and the gray dot representing those who do identify. And so what we're seeing here is that there is an existing and significant psychological safety deficit, even when psychological safety is above average. What we found was that there is a positive and significant effect of signaling for those who identify as LGBT, such that they are it's almost a full point. You can see that they rise significantly as signaling increases. But to me, what was also very interesting was that we see a positive and significant effect, even though for those who are not, right? So even if your identity is not targeted by these very specific inclusion efforts, you still see a positive. This little asterisk means that that effect is significant. Result for those who don't identify. And what I think is even more important is that you see a reconciliation in that psychological safety deficit, that at high signaling environments, that psychological safety deficit is 0. It does lose significance, like right about here on the, I don't know if you can see my mouse actually, but right about at a 0.6. So when they're doing a little bit more than average of these signals, you start to see this deficit decrease, but it's 0 when signaling is robust, which I think is just really important. In the study, we also asked them to report their behaviors in the workplace, and we found that for LGBT employees, yes, their psychological safety increased, and as a result, they were more likely to share these identities in their workplace casually, right? Like we're not talking about explicit sharing, but being likely to share who you are, right, completely in the workplace and not feeling like you have to conceal. And we also saw a direct effect. So while most of this is happening through increased psychological safety, some of it is also probably happening through those social norms that we talked about. What's good and right and normal at this workplace? We see a very similar pattern for those who are not LGBT identified, such that they are increased in psychological safety and that they actually also report being more likely to engage in ally work at the individual level, which is really important for organizations who are seeking to create equitable environments. You need buy-in from all of your employees, right? And we see a large portion of this effect happening directly. And so I think this effect is even more driven by norms, what's good and normal in the organization. So it just shows you how important it is for organizations themselves to take stances that are specific and intentional on these types of topics. What was really interesting for us as an exploratory effect, we wanted to just ask those who are non-LGBT, who are cisgender and heterosexual, to think about other identities that they have that might feel intimidating to share. So we talked about sexual orientation and gender identity, but there are lots of concealable identities that might be stigmatized, right? Things like religion, parental status, if you don't want to disclose that you're a parent, or disabilities that are non-visible. And these are all things that you choose whether or not you tell people in the workplace or whether or not you hide. And so what we did was we asked these participants to think of an identity that they felt that way about, that was still a big part of who they were, but that they didn't always feel like they could share freely. And we just asked them in each of these conditions, did you feel like more or less likely to share this identity? And we found a really strong, significant positive effect, which to us indicated that even when your identity was not explicitly targeted, when organizations do things like this to promote inclusion, it generally benefits everybody's willingness to share who they are. And so I think this is really strong evidence, again, of this positive effect for everyone and the rising tide that lifts all ships, right? When we target and are specific about inclusion for those who maybe have some of the most stigmatized or marginalized identities, everybody feels safer to share who they are. So this study is really great because we know exactly what we're measuring. We have very tight control over the things that we ask, the situations in which we collect data, and so we have very, very good validity in the study that we just discussed. But because I didn't manipulate anything in the study, we have limited causal evidence. So it could be that people are reporting on their organizations that both have high psychological safety and do inclusion signaling, but it's because something else that they're actually experiencing these positive effects that just happens to correlate with both of those variables as well. And it can also be difficult to apply these effects to the real world because I'm getting data, again, online from participants. So to alleviate at least one of these concerns, I pulled some archival data, so pre-existing data, and matched it across platforms to see if we could still see these positive effects in some real world pre-existing data. And so I took the CEI index that I discussed previously, that's again publicly available on HRC's website, and they do this evaluation for the Fortune 1000 company list. I matched that with Glassdoor ratings on culture and values, which you can actually parse out by identity group. So I took these two metrics for this company list and I matched them. And then I also included just like industry data, things like revenue, of course, Fortune rank, other aspects of the organization that, again, are all publicly available, but are from unique and distinct sources, right? So you have less of a concern of confounding or like survey validity issues where, if you have all of the scales together, maybe they answer similarly and that can influence your data. So these are three unique sources that I'm matching these data across. Of course, culture and values isn't a perfect proxy for psychological safety, but I think we can get pretty close with this idea. And so what we found was, again, positive effects that as CEI score increases, so do the culture and value ratings from LGBT Glassdoor respondents. So as organizations are getting better at CEI, they're getting more positive culture ratings from this subsection of employees. What is even more interesting to me is that we also see a strong positive effect for non-LGBT employees, further reasserting that when we are intentional about inclusion efforts, everybody benefits. And I think this is such an important distinction. Unfortunately, we did not have any of these behavioral DVs in this data because it was our archival data, but we did have a lot of controls that we could implement. And so I just want to point out that these effects were robust to other reasons you might want to work for an organization. Things like revenue, their rank, and even individual level career opportunities, how much you felt like you could advance in that organization. Inclusion felt even more important than some of these other things. Okay, so with this study, we do have initial evidence of these effects in the real world, which is really great when we can see this in real world data, but we still can't infer causality. We're using some proxies, and I think that that's okay for this particular study, but really what we care about is If we hold everything else consistent, right? Because there still could be some confounding variables in this particular case. But if we hold everything consistent and we just manipulate inclusion signaling and we turn it on and off like a light switch, can we see that these effects are actually very closely tied to institution level inclusion signaling? And so that's what we try to accomplish in the third study, which is an experiment. In this experiment, what we did is we asked potential employees to look at an organization's handbook. This organization was a fictional organization that we made up, but we gave it really positive characteristics. So we asked these prospective employees to look at this handbook for a company that we called InvoCorp. And we told them that InvoCorp was a really great place to work. It was positive. Everybody has fun. They work hard, and they really care about serving their clients well. That they have lots of resource groups in the community, that they do pro-social giving. We tried to make this organization sound like a good place to work. We manipulated whether or not this organization had high organization level inclusion signaling or not. So in the high inclusion signaling condition, we said specifically that there is an LGBTQ plus resource group and that they are involved in the local community pride initiative, and that they are actually engaged in their community by providing resources for homeless LGBTQ plus youth. In the low inclusion signaling, I also want to point out that this was still positive, right? This is still pro-social. It's still a good thing to do, but we're missing the specific and targeted inclusion signal. And I'm just giving you kind of like the brochure of this manipulation. It's much longer and there are many other elements that were manipulated, but this is a really good example, I think, because it shows that we're really comparing organizations that are generally positive and generally pro-social to organizations that are also that, but that also have intentional inclusion signaling to show the importance of being intentional and specific. And so we manipulated this condition. We asked them about psychological safety, how much psychological safety they would expect to experience in this workplace. And then we asked them about these behavioral DVs or dependent variables to see if they would be more likely to say that they would disclose or not disclose, as well as individual level ally work. And so what we found in the low signaling environment is that, again, psychological safety is hovering at about average. And this is something you would expect in an experiment like this, right? Like this is, people are imagining working in this context. So we wouldn't necessarily see psychological safety being very high. It's kind of right around average. But you still see this existing and significant psychological safety deficit between identity groups, such that LGBT individuals are expecting to experience less psychological safety than their non-LGBT counterparts, even in generally pro-social environments. In the high signaling condition, this deficit is completely erased. And not only is the deficit completely gone, but everybody showed a significant increase in their expected psychological safety. When we look at this in terms of my larger model, we see again a positive effect on potential identity disclosure from those who identify as LGBT, sexual and gender minorities. And we see a positive direct effect as well. So again, I just want to point out that I think theoretically this is coming both from an increase in psychological safety and a shifting in organizational norms. Finally, we see a positive indication that those who are not LGBT are more likely to engage in individual level ally work. Again, largely via psychological safety. In this study, we don't see a direct effect of just changing norms, likely because it's an experiment. And again, I've kind of discussed the differences in different types of studies, but that's just something to note here. In this study, we were also able to ask this exploratory question again, the personal identities for those who are not LGBT. So again, we asked our participants to think of an identity that felt very much a part of them, but that felt maybe sometimes intimidating to share. And again, we find that they are much more likely to disclose this identity when the organization described had intentional inclusion signaling, even though this identity was not targeted by the signal. Again, showing just how important this is for all employees. Okay, so I'll give you just a quick summary of the effects that I talked about today. First, if I didn't say it enough times, intentional and specific inclusion signaling is really important for organizations seeking to rectify psychological safety deficits. If you care about having a diversity of opinions, having and really engaging with the diversity that you've worked so hard to encourage in your organization. Intentional inclusion signaling can be really instrumental in getting that done, beyond just generally positive environments. And we see that this kind of comes from a top-down effect, right? Inclusion signaling at the organization level sets the norms for what's appropriate behavior and who should expect to feel psychological safety in this particular workplace. We see that it leads to a reduction in identity concealment amongst anyone that has a stigmatized identity. And we see that it positively influences individual level ally norms against those who we would hope would step up and be allies in the organization. And so I wanted to leave you from this research, from the broad research on psychological safety and inclusion, some actionable things that you can do in your own organizations to foster psychological parity. So first, I want you to think about being sensitive to other people's differences. I talked a little bit at the beginning of this talk about things that can cause psychological safety deficits, and oftentimes there are things happening outside of your organizations. There are things like social hierarchies, or things that might be happening socially and politically. And these are things that can impact psychological safety even going into your organization. There's some research on megathreats by Lay and Malwani you can look into on this topic, but acknowledging this in the workplace can be really important for letting employees know that you know what might be affecting them outside of the organization. Another thing that we talked about, and I think actually Marco mentioned this at the beginning of this session, is that we don't need to always shy away from conflict. Conflict, when handled appropriately, can actually increase psychological safety. When you have people with a diversity of opinions and a diversity of backgrounds come together to problem solve, sometimes conflict will occur because you have lots of different opinions and backgrounds. And those things can, they can be constructive if you engage in conflict in the right, healthy way. And we can actually see once those boundaries have been tested, that psychological safety increases in the long term. Lead by example. Many of you are industry leaders. You may be leaders in your own organizations and your own social circles. And while the importance of the organization level initiatives cannot be understated, people look to leaders to understand what's appropriate behavior in the workplace. And so if you are a leader, if you have social capital, status, and power can be really important for showing others how to behave in a given environment. And lastly, for those of you who are leaders in your organization, when you do have social power, you have the ability to amplify those who may not have that. And so when you see somebody who maybe is trying to express voice, trying to express an opinion or thought that may not be more readily heard, you can use your position as a leader to amplify their voices. And actually, research has shown that when you amplify, both you and the person you amplify gain respect from your peers. So I hope these are some helpful, actionable things that you can do in your own organizations to increase psychological safety. Lastly, I will just mention that we are looking right now for corporate research partners. And what that means is that if you're at an organization where you want to think about psychological safety, where you want to figure out a better way to diversify your talent pool or to encourage inclusion in the workplace, those of us at Haas who are doing DEIB research are looking for organizations with those types of challenges or even just that type of interest to help us with this kind of cutting edge management research. And so that can look like letting us reanalyze employee pulse data, working with us to collect new data, but we try to do this in a way that's mutually beneficial. So oftentimes we'll take this and we'll offer a myriad of trainings, executive trainings, if this is something you're interested in, on things like diversification, inclusion, and belonging, or things that are more general like negotiation or communication. Or even like what we talked about today, fostering psychological safety. So if you are interested in helping us with this type of research, please send me an email. It was really lovely to get to speak with you all today, and I so appreciate the questions. I think we have some time now for more. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. We did get a few questions, some in the chat box and some in the Q&A. The first one I see in the Q&A as, what are the role of trade unions in building psychological safety? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I muted myself and I shouldn't have. That is such an interesting question. I am not somebody who studies unions, but I can say that I know that unions can help give power to those who would otherwise be powerless. And so sometimes unions, I think, from my understanding, again, I'm not a union researcher, and I think that we actually need a lot more research on the way that unions function with organizations. But my intuition would tell me that when you give those who may not typically have power in organizations a platform to be able to voice without fear, my guess is that influences psychological safety positively. Thank you for that question. I am actually going to think about that as I go into this next stage of research. So I hope we can connect on that again.
Thank you. Another question that came up from Nima Sherpa is about what happens when someone from a minority group comes into a leadership position and they aren't helping bring psychological safety to the situation. What can be done in that type of situation?
Mm. Yeah, so there is some research on the psychology behind this, because it is something that we sometimes see in leadership roles when those who are not typically selected for leadership roles end up in leadership positions. It can feel more tenuous, right? Like it can feel like your job or your position as a leader is not as secure as it would be if you had a different racial identity or a different, majority group identity. And so, it's really unfortunate that this is the case, but I think building psychological safety in leaderships, this is something that often doesn't get thought about in research, because you assume that when you're in positions of power, you automatically have psychological safety, right? You don't fear backlash anymore. And that's not the case for everybody. And so I think building psychological safety for leaders is oftentimes just as important so that they can pass that down the ladder, right? For those who might be working under somebody who it doesn't feel like they, have your back in a way that you would expect them to, that can be really challenging for your psychological experience. And so I would encourage you to look for other allies in the organization who maybe do have positions of power, while also being careful not to undermine those who are, in leadership roles who might also be psychologically unsafe. That is such a complex topic, and I appreciate the question. It's an area, it's kind of a new area of research. And so I think that's a really insightful question and something we don't have all the answers to yet. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Here's another from Richard Velasquez. How do you approach psychological safety for those with different political identities? For example, conservatives versus liberals, which is also not readily visible. That seems to be a growing problem in the workplace that that person has observed. And I just want to throw in that, our Bridging the Divides course that alumni have access to, that again, my colleague Katrina Koski helped create, will be a great space to have that, because that's to talk about that, because that is that's exactly what it's about. But I don't know if you want to add any thoughts here on that, Alex.
Yeah, I can add more than thoughts, because this is actually my next stream of research. One of my thoughts here was like, okay, we're breaking this up into like pretty broad categories, right? Like LGBT and then like anyone who's not. But there might be more nuanced effects, right, within that broader group. And so in some of that's funny that you asked that, because I literally have the slides right here. We look at these effects that I just showed you by political ideology. And what we found was, so the blue, these are not great graphs, sorry, they're kind of like my extra slides, but the blue represents liberals, so darker blue represents more liberal. The red over here represents as you get more conservative, it gets more red. And what we find is, like, yes, for liberals, these effects are still very strong and very positive, but these effects don't become negative for conservatives. Even this line right here, like or this line right here, this darkest red line, you see that while it does start to become more equal, these effects just become null. And so while we don't see the same psychological safety increase for the most conservative of conservatives, we're not seeing negative effects. However, we do see positive behavioral effects, which is really interesting to me. So even though we're not seeing a psychological safety benefit, it could be because this group might be made up of those who hold a majority identity that allows them to already feel psychologically safe at work. It could be because they're just ignoring these things that happen in the workplace. I'm not sure. This is something I'm looking into now. But you do see a difference in behavior, such that those who identify as conservative in the control condition are much less likely to engage in individual ally work than they would be in environments that propose inclusion. And so what this is telling me is that norms, again, are very important. But if, again, the case was that conservatives, even the most conservative of conservatives, were experiencing negative effects to their psychological safety, that's something that we would want to know. It's just not what I'm seeing in any of my data. That's not to say that there aren't other things we might want to look at when it comes to political ideology, but I love this question because it really does provide like a nuanced take on this data. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Speaking of nuanced takes, I think that's a great thought. Did your research factor in intersectionality within the group and how psychological safety will be impacted? For example, Black, Brown, and LGBTQ plus people, or Black, Brown, LGBTQ plus people who have a disability.
Yeah. This work did not take an intersectional approach. We do, of course, think about this theoretically as intersectional, but when you're powering samples like this, it can be really hard to make clear. It can be really hard to like clearly parse out the effects based on subsections of different. You would have to really get a lot of people to take your study basically to find these effects intersectionally. We do look at these effects when we just break out, again, this very large group of non-LGBT individuals. When I look at them in terms of like racial marginalization, we don't ask about ability. So that could be a future direction, and something that I know folks at Haas are working on right now, is the difference in experiences of able-bodied versus those who are not in the workplace. But in this work, I find that the effects also positively occur for those with racially marginalized identities. And so I think that the effects would probably be slightly stronger. At least in this work, I'm not looking at things intersectionally. But I think I stand by the assertion that I see broad positive influence. But, you know, of course, that's something that we need to think about as we're going forward with this research. So thank you for that thought.
Thank you. Right. Well, there's another question that's, I think, related, but to one question you already answered. Let me know, you know, if you think you. But how have you studied how this applies in different sectors? For instance, how does it play out in an elected government body, such as a workplace that is driven by elected leaders, city officials, county or school boards, state legislators, etc.?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. So in my larger study in this package, which would have been the first, just we ask people about their workplace, we do break it out by industry, and we don't see huge differences by industry. The industries where we do see differences are industries that might be considered more like blue collar work, which could be a factor of like unionization to that person who asked about that. So thank you for that question, because it actually gave me a lot to think about. In terms of like government influence, so maybe the underlying idea here is like in different industries, things may feel more or less authentic, right? Like when you have an elected official, sometimes you might get the intuition that somebody's saying something just because they want to be elected and not because they actually believe it. And I can imagine that would influence the way that these signals actually like function in the workplace. And so in some of my later research, I do think about authenticity and how authentic these signals feel as a huge mediating factor in their influence. And I can imagine if authenticity felt different based on the structure of the organization, that would dampen the effects, right? Like if it feels inauthentic, it's going to be less effective in removing that psychological safety deficit. This is just conjecture, and I know I'm probably not answering your question super well, but it's just not something I have a lot of data on. But thank you for the question. I hope it was at least interesting of an answer.
Thank you. Someone else asked, how did you get involved in this work, in this research?
Yeah. I think like any level of research that you do as like a person with a marginalized identity is like a little bit of me search, right? Like I care about the organizations that I work for and what they're doing to promote equity. And I just was kind of sitting back and thinking, especially when I was working in a state where these things were so viscerally under attack, I kind of just thought like, I don't think this is true. I don't think that people with majority group identities are being psychologically harmed here. And I am somebody who just like benefits so much psychologically from these types of initiatives. And so I think some of it can be me search, but there's also this theoretical question happening right now in management research of like, what is the purpose of organization level DEI? How effective is it? And so I think the intersection of like I have identities that I think would align with this, that I wanted to understand how things like this function in the workplace, and also the theoretical need to understand this when we're informing management practice together led me down this path of research. It's kind of one of the best parts of being a researcher, is you get to do things that you're passionate about. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. One more. How do you bring people on board with DI initiatives when they're resistant, especially when they hold views like queer people should or need to keep their deviant views to themselves? I don't, in parentheses, I don't agree with these views at all, but it's something I've heard a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's something we thought about when we were doing this research, because so when we were doing this research, and that is just such a, I mean, harmful existing belief in society that I'm so sorry that people have to deal with this. But we knew that it did exist, and that some people do hold this belief that this is like morally wrong behavior that shouldn't exist in the world, right? And so what we wanted to know first, right, is like, how many people actually believe this? How many people actually think that this population does not deserve equal human rights, right? That they don't deserve to have marriage equality, that they shouldn't exist, or they shouldn't exist as people in the workplace. And what we thankfully found is that that's actually a very small percentage of people. In any given study, we ask this question in a way that hopefully people are answering honestly. We ask this question, and maybe like out of a sample of 1,000, 10 people would say something like that. Does not preclude the harm that comes from those underlying beliefs in society. But what we find in the research is that people with very extreme beliefs like that are much harder to shift with these types of initiatives. And so they may need a different approach, right? Like you may need to approach that type of person and with a mindset of like harm reduction rather than a mindset of like trying to get them to change their beliefs. Because this is such an important question, it is something we thought about in our research, and it's why we wanted to know how many people actually think this way in organizations. And very luckily, according to our data, it seems like a pretty small population. It's much more common to just be like neutral, which again, we want people to be active allies in the workplace. So that's what we're trying to shift people from neutral perspectives to allyship, not from one extreme to the other. I understand that question, and thank you for asking. It is something we've thought very deeply about.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer.